New York has a problem, and it's a big problem, a $30 billion with a B problem. That's how much money the state says it's going to lose in tax revenue over the next 2 years because of the coronavirus. And for the past few months, Governor Andrew Cuomo has hedged his bets on the federal government filling that gap. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen, at least not anytime soon. Congress has not come to a deal on a stimulus package, and Cuomo's relationship with President Trump probably won't get better as we head into this year's elections. So now the state has to consider other options for filling the deficit. And broadly speaking, there's two of them. Either get money from somewhere else or cut state spending. Right now, Cuomo says the state's planning to cut spending in the short term and see how it shakes out down the road.
If they don't provide state and local funding, it will be financial chaos. The deficit is so large that we would have to do everything. We'd have to cut the budgets, and cutting the budgets hurts, especially now.
But no one wants to cut spending because that would probably mean less money for schools and health care. So Democrats who control the state legislature are considering a few proposals to bring more money into the state's coffers, mostly by taking it from the wealthy. The one they talk about most is raising tax rates on people with a lot of money. And we're not talking about people who make six figures. We're talking about multimillionaires and billionaires. And it's not a new idea. Some lawmakers supported higher taxes on the wealthy before the pandemic to put more funding into things like education and social services. State Senator Jessica Ramos from Queens is one of those Democrats.
The income inequality issue in New York has been the worst in the country for a very long time, way before the pandemic. And so what we've always wanted to do is balance the scale more so that we're actually able to help those least among us.
Ramos supports legislation from State Senator Rachel May, which would raise taxes on people making over $100 million each year. But she also has her own bill to tax the rich called a mark-to-market tax. It would only apply to the state's billionaires, and it would create a new tax on what are called capital gains. That's when the value of something goes up, but you don't sell it. Think of stocks. If you invest in something and its stock goes up, that stock is now worth more than when you bought it. But you don't profit unless you sell the stock. Ramos wants the state to treat that difference in value as income and have it taxed. She says it could generate more than $5 billion for the state every year from the wealthy.
They've made $77 billion over the past 4 months. And so asking them to contribute just enough for all of them to come up with $5.5 billion is really chump change to them and would provide some stability for thousands of New Yorkers.
That money would then be used to pay about $3,000 every month to certain low-income people. And while everyone agrees that the state and federal governments need to find a way to help those people, not everyone wants to do it by raising taxes. State Senator Pam Helming is a Republican who represents a district between Rochester and Syracuse. She's worried that rich people will move to another state if New York tries to make it more expensive to live here, especially in the age of COVID, when people have learned to work from anywhere.
So to me, the concern is if we do this tax on millionaires and billionaires, and they're primarily located in the city area, they now know they can work from anywhere, they are going to relocate and they're going to take their jobs with them. That's going to mean problems, right, for working class people.
Believe it or not, Governor Cuomo actually sides with the Republicans on that point. He's worried the state could lose a major part of its tax base if rich people move somewhere else. Right now, more than 40% of the total income tax collected by New York State every year comes from the top 1% of earners. So if New York loses even a small share of those people, it could mean a lot for the state's bottom line. And we're at a time right now when a lot of rich people are considering a move out of New York after what happened with the coronavirus. Here's E.J. McMahon, an economic analyst from the Empire Center for Public Policy.
So you've got people who are on the fence, who are actively considering, well, am I going to come back to New York State or not? Or maybe am I going to move possibly somewhere else now? What do I think? And the message sent by these proposals is, well, get lost, or it's going to cost you to come back. We have added costs, and we're going to shove the entire added cost to you if you come back.
But it's also worth noting that this isn't the first time New York would be asking its wealthiest residents to pay more in taxes after a crisis. New York City raised taxes on high-income earners after 9/11 to help with the city's recovery. And in the middle of the Great Recession, when New York was facing a budget deficit of nearly $14 billion, the state raised tax rates for people making more than $1 million a year. That was called the millionaire's tax, and it's actually still in effect today. That means wealthy earners in New York City actually pay the second highest income tax rate in the country. But it also means that people who make $1 million a year pay the same tax rate as people who make $1 billion a year. It's those super high income earners that Democrats want to raise taxes on. And some analysts warn that if we don't raise taxes on the super rich, the rest of the state will pay the price.
We cannot ask those who have been most impacted by this pandemic to shoulder the burden of balancing the budget. It's simply unreasonable. And history has shown us over and over again that when we're in times of crisis, we ask the wealthiest among us to pay a little bit more.
Lawmakers like Ramos also raised the point that, as of now, New York is out of options for raising revenue. And if the only other option to cut spending is raising taxes on the wealthy, it seems like a no-brainer to them. The revenue generated from taxing high-income earners would be used to fund things that a larger share of residents rely on, like schools and local governments. And it's those people that Ramos says she's worried about losing to other states if New York has to cut spending.
The more working class folks we lose, that's already our tax base. If we keep losing them, our coffers are going to be lighter. So anything we get from billionaires is actually a net gain.
And we don't know if the rich will actually move out of the state if they're hit with higher tax rates. It's been more than a decade since New York enacted the millionaire's tax, and the state has still gained thousands of millionaires in that time. Supporters of higher taxes on the rich believe wealthy people will stay in New York because they like it here, and the high taxes are worth it.
The reality is that billionaires can live anywhere they want, and they choose to live in New York because they want to live in New York, they're connected to New York, right?
But that's just one idea for closing the state's budget gap. There's another that would still create new taxes on the rich even if they move their primary home to another state. It's called the pied-à-terre tax, and it's not a new idea. It would place a special tax on second homes in New York City worth more than $5 million. It's designed to target people wealthy enough to own a second home in the 5 boroughs, whether they live there or not. It's sponsored by State Senator Brad Hoylman, who says it could apply to as many as 5,000 homes in New York City right now.
The very wealthy who use New York City as a safe and secure place to keep their wealth is undertaxing them. And they're not paying income tax, they're paying very little taxes elsewhere in the city and the state of New York. So this is a way, I believe, for New York and New York City to recoup its losses as it pertains to these very wealthy people.
Hoylman says the tax could generate hundreds of millions of dollars each year. One downside, that money would only be collected by New York City, not the state. But it could take some pressure off Albany to fix the city's finances. New York City is facing a $9 billion budget deficit on its own over the next 2 years. And for that kind of shortfall, there's no silver bullet. Even if the state passed both the pied-à-terre tax and the mark-to-market tax, New York City and New York State would still be billions of dollars short of filling their budget gaps. That's why some think the state should be looking at ways to cut spending in the short term to preserve services in the long term. Here's Assemblyman Ed Rah, a Republican from Long Island.
Our tax base, the more we rely on these individuals, the more volatile it gets. And I think that, like I said, something that is very attractive in the short term may end up just kicking the can down the road and us still having to find ways to deal with the things that we want to be able to fund, like education and higher education and healthcare.
Rah is the highest-ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee in the Assembly, which negotiates the state budget every year. And he's part of a group of lawmakers that think the state could be spending the money it already has in a more efficient way. Some analysts say that doesn't have to be done in a way that dramatically impacts services. Take school aid, for example. Right now, the state is planning 20% cuts to school districts across the board. But E.J. McMahon from the Empire Center says there are other ways the state could be saving money on education.
There's going to have to be a significant cut in school aid. The school aid cut should be targeted to those districts that are least dependent on state aid, which is the wealthiest district, to provide a measure of protection for the poorest district. And all districts should be relieved of the obligation to be paying generous pay increases during this recession.
But Democrats also have other ideas to raise revenue for the state, and one could raise as much as $16 billion for the state every year. It's called the stock transfer tax. It would place a new tax of 0.25% on stock transactions. So for every dollar, that means it would be taxed 1/4 cent. And it's actually not new. The stock transfer tax was in place for decades before the state did away with it in the early 80s. But now some Democrats say it's time to bring the tax back, especially when the stock market is doing so well. Assemblyman Phil Steck sponsors a bill to reinstate the tax.
I think ironically, the stock transfer tax is the hardest one to avoid for a number of reasons. One, as we've seen in this time period, the market has been doing extremely well, even though the rest of the economy has not been.
There's not enough support in the legislature for reinstating the tax, and there's a few reasons for that. When the tax was dropped in the 80s, it was partly out of the fear that the stock market would move to New Jersey. Steck says that some lawmakers think that might still happen if the tax comes back, and some say that's not out of the realm of possibilities.
Again, the risk is you do it in New York, and all you do is you give more people a bigger incentive to do whatever they do somewhere else. These are all these things are sort of seen as geese laying golden eggs that aren't laying enough eggs. So let's cut them open and pull the eggs out. And what you end up with is a dead goose.
But supporters of the stock transfer tax say the market is doing so well right now that not imposing the tax would almost be negligent. Despite the pandemic, the S&P 500 still hit a record high in August. And Steck says New Jersey's track record for trying to steal the stock market hasn't played out so well in the past.
We had it in New York for a very long time. It caused no harm. No one moved anywhere. And by the way, New Jersey tried a million ways to try and induce brokerage firms, the stock exchange, to move to New Jersey.
All of these proposals have their downsides. The mark-to-market tax, some say that might not even be legal under the Constitution. But more Democrats have moved closer this year to supporting the concept of raising revenue from the wealthiest New Yorkers. Both the Assembly Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader have said their members would back something like that, but lawmakers have yet to strike a deal on an actual bill. And then there's the possibility of a veto from Governor Cuomo if he doesn't like the idea. Democrats don't have enough votes right now to override that veto, but that could change in this year's elections. Either way, lawmakers won't return to Albany unless they have a bill to pass. And in an election season, that's anyone's guess.